I would like to ask Professor James Clark from Florida State University to hold his presentation.
I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here, and on behalf of Florida State University and the College of Social Work, I want to express my gratitude to the professors who organized this wonderful conference. I appreciated very much the remarks made by the dean in terms of being right on target about the importance of social work and how social work is deeply interrelated with the social sciences. And we're very honored to be at this university. And also want to thank the representative from the ministry for her remarks. And I like very much the fact that there is a division regarding the innovation in higher education, which is very important. And some of my remarks today will be about what's going on in higher education in the United States. I am not an expert on Hungary. I'm learning about Hungary, thanks to the wonderful opportunity to be here. Perhaps some of what we discuss about the United States will have applications for Hungary. This is just an abstract of the talk, just for your information. Social work is a rapidly growing profession in the United States. There's over 650,000 social workers practicing in every single sector of the private and public agencies that you can think of, everything from businesses to hospitals, healthcare, prisons, mental health work, addiction services. There are social workers involved in the business of philanthropy. Major corporations are hiring social work to help adapt technologies to particular populations and communities. Over the last 20 years, I think it's become one of the most popular professions in the United States, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States has designated it as the third fastest growing profession in the United States. And for those of you who know the size and scope of America, that's saying something, that social work would be in the top professions in terms of its growth. And some of the presentations that will be made from our delegation from the United States will touch on how social work is making impacts in different areas of the world and in our country, and also the value of professionalizing the workforce. Why should students get undergraduate and graduate degrees? In the United States, the Master of Social Work is the major degree in which people doing the kind of work that I described are doing. So we have some of the same interesting problems that I think are found around the world regarding universities and societies and governments trying to figure out the role of social work, what education should be associated with it, what credentialing, what licensure should be part of the development of the profession to make it the most effective it can be. And these are not easy issues, and I'll talk about a few of the challenges that we face in social work education. We really cannot, in my opinion, talk about the challenges in social work education in the United States unless we talk about some of the pressures that are on higher education in general and on the universities in general. When I first began to think about entering academic life back in the 1980s, I used to remember my professors when I was going to school as living a rather serene existence, or what I thought was a serene existence, of spending many hours in study and research and writing, and having a very good idea of what their careers would look like, and that the university in many ways being an island or a refuge of reason and of study and intellectual development and instruction and teaching. I think when you look at the United States and American higher education now, it is often on college campuses, not unlike what was happening in the 1968 and that era, where all of the major problems and controversies and political clashes are occurring right on campus. And as a result, in public universities especially, there are great pressures that administrators, leaders, and professors, and for that matter, students face as being part of a campus community, a university community. And today I'm going to talk mostly about public higher education. And public education is different than private education in that the public universities have support, financial and governmental legitimacy bestowed upon it in terms of its mission and in terms of its operation. So U.S. public education is much more subject to the influence and pressures of the larger society and of changes in government and political changes than the private universities are. And of course, the famous private universities like Harvard and Yale and Columbia, University of Chicago, have less of that in that they have their own sources of income, including very high tuitions and endowments, and they're run by their own boards. In the public university, from year to year, the operation of the university is dependent on the governor and the legislature of the particular state that the university is situated in. And as a result, there's a lot of political discussion going on all the time about, is the university doing its job? Which is many academics find sometimes very offensive, because we as academics sometimes forget where the money is coming from. And we, as traditionally and historically, have not had to be necessarily accountable. So some of the criticisms that we receive at the university are the criticisms that somehow studying at the university and supporting the university has not been a good return on investment for the taxpayer, which is the way in America we criticize organizations we don't like. We say they do not have a good return on investment for the public tax dollar. And so universities have been very, very, I know at a Florida State University, we are held very accountable through a series of metrics, of outcome measures that have to be met on an annual basis to receive operating funds, but then also another set of metrics that must be met for to receive special research funding. And there's only two universities up till now in Florida have received the research dollars. So we are operating always with this idea of we're being audited by the federal government and by state government. And there's a great deal of attention as to what goes on at the university, not only in Florida, but every state of the union. I think on one hand, this creates great pressure. On the other hand, the good part of that is that I found in Florida, and for our university, we've been able to demonstrate the high value of education, both on the instruction and the research side of what we do. So I think our leadership has been, and our faculty have been very intelligent and shrewd in taking up these accountability measures and using them to educate the public and to educate or political leaders about the value of the university. In other states, in the other U.S. states, they've been less successful. I think the university I spent many years, 21 years, the University of Kentucky, has been far less successful than Florida in being able to demonstrate their value, and they receive much less money from much less, smaller percentage of the state budget goes to higher education as a result. So the use of metrics and measures, and I know Professor Ellis will talk about this right after me, may feel in higher education as a pressure, but it can also be turned into a marvelous opportunity to educate and demonstrate the high level of value. Part of the public pressure on university has been the stress on workforce development. And this is very important when we talk about professional education, because some look at university education as simply preparing students to be workers who fill particular niches or slots in the economy. And in the United States, drawing on our rich Anglo and European heritage, the heritage of a university like this that's hundreds of years old, unlike our universities, but we draw on this great tradition of developing the human being as a person. And a lot of that means that we are more interested in educated graduates rather than simply trained or prepared graduates for the economy. Of course, we want to prepare our students to have high-paying, successful careers and to have high value in the workforce. At the same time, we know that that usually happens in the professions for students that are deeply and profoundly educated, who can draw on the liberal arts, for example, of art and literature, music, poetry, philosophy, the humanities, and then the broad swath of social sciences, of psychology, economics, sociology, etc. In professions that generate some of their own knowledge, but it's far more specific to the professional activity, the liberal arts remain crucial for our students to understand history and to understand the larger context for the kind of work we're doing, and that everything we do is historically, economically, socially, culturally influenced. Education and higher education's mission is to help prepare professionals to understand that and to be able all their lives to return to those important sources of knowledge and of moral instruction and edification as we do our work. Another pressure on U.S. public higher education is to prepare, and I think this is a very good pressure, is to prepare our students to be able to work in teams and to be able to work with people that are different than they are, of different social classes, races, nationalities, religions, ethnicities. And right now in the United States, there's certain movements in the United States that are criticizing the emphasis in higher education on diversity. Yet, if you look at what the major corporations and the leaders in all sectors of society are saying, is they need diversity in their organizations to create innovation. The great enemy of innovation and of progress, and in the private sector, the great enemy of business success, and in the public sector, the great enemy of successful outcomes and service to the public, is groupthink. This idea that we all should be thinking the same thing and looking at the world in the same way. When you have a group of people who are doing that day in and day out, especially if they're in leadership of a corporation or a university or any organization, they will continue to get the same answers over and over again, no matter what the problems are. And this leads to stagnation. It leads to failure. And so there is a great disconnect in our society right now where there are many critiques of diversity and a discouragement of it in some sectors of our society and even our government, when all the research and even from business all the way through the sciences are showing that there has to be teamwork and there has to be diversity. There's a wonderful study called Project Aristotle that was recently conducted by Google. And Google, you probably have heard of, is primarily made up of engineers, especially software and hardware engineers, who are changing the world in terms of information and communication. And they were trying to understand what made great teams, and they discovered that what made the most successful teams were teams where there was the psychological safety for diverse ideas to emerge. Those were the strongest teams, no matter what the task was. Another emphasis in U.S. public higher education, a pressure, has been on the development of STEM. And this is an area that has been important to achieve, especially, I'd say, between the end of World War II and the 1970s and 80s. But sometimes what it has led to is a de-emphasis or a neglect of funding for the arts and the humanities and sometimes the professions. So this emphasis is always, because of the great deal of funding that comes from government and private sector sources on STEM disciplines. In the United States right now, I think there's been a considerable amount of re-examination to try to correct that so that there's more balance. But social work and other professions have sometimes been left out of the discussion, but we're very pushy people, so we're pushing back and saying the professions are as important as these disciplines. There's also great pressure for universities to be, in terms of their national rankings, to be in the top 25, for example. Our university is a number 26 public university, so we're almost at top 25. The bad part of that, or the shortcoming, is sometimes just achieving that can lead to neglecting other important parts of our mission. The positive part of that, and our rise in the rankings in our university, have been a sense of mission and focus and wonderful things like reduction in class sizes and increasing funding for student services and an increase of hiring of faculty. Florida State University just provided 125 new faculty positions last year alone in order to rise in the ranking. So while there is great pressure in terms of rankings, and there can be negatives, there also are positives. And then we always have to be careful about the mission of public education and not losing sight of that. And we have a lot of people, everyone from the media to the government, critiquing, is higher education, is a particular university or college on track, or are they drifting from their mission? This translates sometimes into social work education specifically because while there's a lot of praise for professionalization, there's also in the public sector and sometimes in the private sector opposition to professionalization. And one of the reasons is that when you educate professionals in the way I discussed, we end up graduating people who can think critically, who can think independently, who, while they have to work in bureaucracies, may display innovative thinking, new ways of approaching things. And some government agencies in the United States, in different sectors, like child welfare or criminal justice, don't like young people who think for themselves. They would prefer to have people who just follow orders or will just follow the policies. And one of the struggles we have in the United States is when we educate our young people, especially at the master's degree level, and we help them develop this high standard of thinking critically and independently, we also have to prepare them for the kind of organizational resistance they may have. And our great hope in the United States is that more and more of these creative, innovative thinkers will become leaders in these agencies and no longer be afraid of new ideas and new approaches. But it's very difficult to be an independent thinker in a bureaucracy. And as a result, change in those large government agencies and in some of the larger private agencies has been very slow and gradual. Meanwhile, our problems in the United States, our social problems, are becoming increasingly complex for many reasons. And as we face more and more income inequality, where the top 1% of our citizens have most of the wealth in the country, and many parts of government are being run by people who don't really believe in public service, who underfund important government services. What results is very great pressures on social work educators to continue to have a high standard of education, creating and graduates who are independent thinkers, who are complex thinkers, who can embrace complexity, when sometimes they're facing work and careers with organizations and leaders that devalue those things. But our mission as in social work education is not only to really work with students in developing a higher and complex thinking and reasoning and moral development, but also to push and influence society to more aggressively, robustly, and justly address social problems in our society. That's another part of the mission of the university. So there are pressures not to do that, or pressures to do that in a poor way, and we are always in social work education, especially I know in our college and many of our colleges that we work with around the country are really fighting to maintain high quality professional education as a part of the social mission as well as part of the mission of higher education. So our responses are, we really see our educators in social work as leaders. We simply don't see them as propagandists or simply technical trainers. We see our educators as leaders, trying to educate our students about, for example, the rich history of social work, which started out as social movements and volunteer movements in response to the great waves of immigration coming into the United States in the early 20th century. And that's really how social work began, as leaders who were working as volunteers or leaders of social movements and political movements responding to the wave of immigration, became friends with and developed relationships with leaders in the disciplines in the universities, and began to take their places as in schools of social science as a valued partner. And in many universities, like mine, becoming their own independent professional college, much like law or medicine. Educating students about this is very important because many of our schools, our colleges that do not teach history, I think deprive our students from the rich heritage they can draw from and the pride that's very important part of professional identity. The other response is to emphasize, as educators, the fiduciary relationship to the public, individual clients that we work with in organizations, but also society, and that the identity of the professional rests primarily on a promise, on a pledge to serve others interests before we serve our own. And if someone graduates from any professional school, but especially a school of social work, and does not understand that they've entered an agreement to put others' interests ahead of their own, there's been a terrible mistake made. And so I know in our program we have wonderful professors who model that all the time, that while my needs are important as an individual, they are secondary to the best interests of the clients, to the best interest of the common good. That's a very difficult way to live a life. It's very challenging morally, intellectually. Intellectually, it's difficult because we're not always sure what the best interests are. And that's why critical thinking about our practice and the context of our practice are so important, because answering what are the best interests for whom and what groups is very puzzling in a complex society like the United States. In our own country, we struggle with, especially over the last 10 years, the advent of powerful media where there's enormous amounts of propaganda by different special interest groups. And our students and the general public have to have a high level of critical thinking in order to sort out what's the difference between propaganda and what claims have true evidence to support them, and to be able to enter into civil discourse around that. I think professionals are especially charged with this. Educated people have to bring this ethos constantly into the workplace in order to be successful as professionals. But this is very difficult in the United States right now, because entertainment in media is often valued much more than science, the humanities, and education. We also have very great intellectual pressures and science pressures that come from explosive new advances in science, both the basic sciences and the applied sciences. So just to select three: social sciences, brain sciences or neurosciences, and behavioral economics now are very influential in the United States. Yet, as all of you know, the work of science is probabilistic in its outcomes. It does not give a simple dichotomous or black and white answers to questions. It is fallible. It is subject to understanding that one must think probabilistically and must entertain claims and studies that are directly opposed to what we might believe at one point in our lives about a particular topic. This is very difficult to do and live comfortably. Part of what we try to do in social work education, just as I know your university and your college here and department here do, is to try to help you through understanding research, the potentials of research, but also the limitations of it and the constraints of it, so one can think intelligently about complex problems. Social work more and more is trying to do this in the classroom earlier and earlier, even at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, involving students in research, even if they are not doctoral students, but are training at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Across the country, there's far more value now in undergraduates and master's level students participating in research projects, writing papers with professors, learning these skills earlier, because it's no longer simply enough that the person at the doctoral level understand these approaches, this approach to knowledge and knowledge development, because every day practitioners are being asked to learn new approaches to working with people that are science-based. And they have to become, practitioners must have a sophisticated understanding of what they're being asked to do, because many times they're being asked to adapt or to tailor scientifically validated approaches for a new population or a new part of the country. So for example, in the 1990s and early 2000s, I was very involved in looking at substance abuse treatment that were developed in big cities, often in university settings, for rural Appalachia, for the countryside. And we realized that many of the approaches, let's say in social skills building, that worked in the big cities were not going to be helpful to rural people because they made no sense to rural people. So we had to find ways of adapting or translating the essential elements of the interventions for the countryside, for rural America, and specifically Appalachian Kentucky, and then to test those adaptations to see if we could still get good outcomes. Our practitioners who were not scientists, who were not involved in university education, were crucial partners in that process. And they were our wonderful participants and wonderful partners. And what we had were many, many discussions about why they should try this new approach and why they should change what they were doing for years for a new approach, and they were a very important part of the research effort. I think for social work to really make breakthroughs in different areas of basic and applied sciences meaningful, we have to do more and more of this work in communities and be dedicated to testing interventions and also to program evaluation, especially outcome evaluation and impact evaluations. We also need to be, I suggested earlier, calling upon the liberal arts foundation. So understanding the power of stories, theories, and statistics. Understanding these are different modes of knowing, different ways of understanding, and understanding the differences in these approaches so that we can draw from the richness of them and not get them confused. So telling a good story can be a powerful and valid way of communicating complex information, but it may not be the best way of communicating a complex scientific problem or something that needs to be communicated in probabilistic and statistical ways. So our students need to be deeply educated and understand how to use all these different forms of knowledge and communication. Interdisciplinarity is important in the United States right now. Social workers especially are working with physicians and lawyers and engineers and business people and politicians and policymakers, every profession you can think of. So we have to prepare our students to understand how to translate what we are talking about into the jargon and language of other professions. Sometimes social workers, and I think we're good at this, take the lead in doing that because we understand that our role often is to lead teams and to help different people communicate with each other. So for example, I do a great deal of work with lawyers who have a very different language and way of understanding knowledge development and professional life than social work. So a lot of my work over the years has been translating complex mental health and addiction research and social psychology research about juries to lawyers who are not really trained as scientists. They're trained in the United States primarily as rhetoricians and experts in law and contracts and procedure. Very important things, but very different. I already spoke about our commitment in the classroom and during our time with our students to practice in policy evaluation. We need to be living those things out. I'll close. I won't be able to, and you'll be very grateful that I'm not going to read this, but I'd want to recommend a book to you because that's what professors do, right? They're always recommending books to their students. And some of the greatest resources I have ever received has been because a professor has suggested I should read a book. And this is an older book, and the other things professors have told me is old books don't mean bad books. Old books are sometimes the best books to read. And for those of you studying social work or any of the social sciences, this book written in 1959 by C. Wright Mills called The Sociological Imagination is a particularly powerful work because what he talks about in that book, and I'm not going to read this all, is to help people develop, students develop a quality of mind that will help them to use information and to develop reason in order to achieve lucid summations of what is going on in the world and of what may be happening within themselves. So students and professionals struggle in their interior world as well as the social world. And what Professor Mills was writing about was those are connected profoundly. And understanding how they are connected and trying to understand that is part of the life of the professional who is also a social scientist. And in this wonderful book, he explores these types of issues with a great deal of verve and zest and humor. So I recommend it highly. I want to close by once again thanking you for the opportunity to share with you some of the struggles we're having in the United States in higher education and in social work education in particular, and how much I'm looking forward to spending the next day and a half with you to learn, the next couple days with you, to learn more about what's going on in this wonderful country that you've allowed all of us to have the opportunity to get to know and cherish at a deeper level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this most thought-provoking and very rich presentation with some of the striking similarities. And I hope we can see our future in the picture when you were just speaking about the successes of social work education in the future. And a special thanks for highlighting the values of liberal arts at this particular place.